Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining our Gutsy Learning Series event today on the Mediterranean diet for Crohn's and colitis. My name is Sarah Gandaharian, and I am the Manager of Patient Programs and Evaluation at Crohn's and Colitis Canada, and I'll be the moderator for the event today. Before we kick things off, we're just going to go over some quick technical logistics. So this session is being offered in both English and French. If you would like to listen in French, please click on the interpretation icon. It's a globe icon that you can find in the Zoom menu bar. And when you do that, you can select French language from those options. If you encounter any technical issues, including accessing the French audio, please try refreshing your website browser or restarting the Zoom webinar in your application first. You can also share any concerns or questions that you have with us using the Q&A box in the Zoom menu bar, and we'll get back to you directly there to help you troubleshoot. I'd also like to acknowledge the rich history and heritage of Canada's Indigenous people. From coast to coast to coast, we recognize the ancestral and unceded territory of the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people who call this land home. Through this acknowledgement, we express respect for the traditional territories of Indigenous communities and contribute to the promotion of reconciliation. I'd also like to issue a disclaimer from Crohn's and Colitis Canada. The content in the presentation from the webinar today is intended solely for educational purposes only. And while the information does hold general value, it may not be applicable to your specific medical situations. So these resources should not be seen as a substitute for the personalized judgment and care of a trained healthcare professional. We also do not endorse any specific external products or services that may be mentioned during the webinar. So if you do have questions, please do consult with your primary healthcare providers. And for those of you that may be joining us for the first time today or may not be as familiar with Crohn's and Colitis Canada, I'd like to share our promise to you. Our organization is dedicated to discovering a cure for Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. Through research, education, and advocacy, our organization strives to also enhance the lives of both children and adults affected by these chronic diseases. We really appreciate your interest in our organization, and we hope to make a positive impact in the lives of the people in the IBD community. If you or someone you know may be affected by Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis, we also invite you to explore our Gutsy support events. These are virtual gatherings that give people in the community an opportunity to meet with one another, to maybe better understand what it's like to live with these diseases, and to maybe better cope with some of the challenges that can come with Crohn's disease or colitis. We also have other upcoming sessions coming up for our Gutsy Learning Series event. The next session is in February, and you can scan the QR codes on the screen there if you'd like to get to the registration page. You can also visit crohnsandcolitis.ca/GLS for more information. Now, I'm thrilled to introduce our speakers for the webinar today. First, I'll introduce Dr. Deanna Gibson. Dr. Gibson is a professor in the Department of Biology at the University of British Columbia at the Okanagan campus. She is the co-chair of Crohn's and Colitis Canada's Scientific and Medical Advisory Committee, also known as SMAC, and sits on the board of directors at Crohn's and Colitis Canada. Dr. Gibson's research interests include the impact of environmental triggers like diet on the gut microbiome and how this influences immunometabolism and the gut-brain axis in IBD. Dr. Gibson was the 2017 recipient of the Crohn's and Colitis Canada grant program that examined how the Mediterranean diet pattern alters the gut microbiome, inflammation, and disease symptoms in ulcerative colitis. Thank you, Dr. Gibson, for joining us. Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Natasha Haskey. Dr. Haskey is a registered dietitian and a clinician researcher whose work focuses on nutrition for IBD and the links between diet, inflammation, and the gut microbiome. Dr. Haskey completed her PhD in June 2022 under the supervision of Dr. Gibson. Dr. Haskey is continuing her research journey working with Dr. Rahman at the University of Calgary as a postdoctoral fellow studying how intermittent fasting influences Crohn's disease. Dr. Haskey has also been accepted into the Triangle Program, which is a national training program aimed at transforming research and patient care in gastroenterology and liver, supported by the Crohn's and Colitis Canada. Thank you, Dr. Haskey, for joining us as well. And I would also like to introduce Jennifer Bennett. Jennifer is joining us as a speaker who will share her lived experience with IBD. Jennifer is from Newfoundland, Canada, and has volunteered with Crohn's and Colitis Canada for the past 17 years. She was diagnosed with ulcerative colitis at 23, shortly after completing her Bachelor of Education. As a person living with IBD, Jennifer has undergone many treatments and surgeries in hopes of managing her disease. Despite all her challenges, she has completed a master's in counseling of psychology at Memorial University and became a Canadian certified counselor. Her passion for cognitive behavioral therapy and the gut-brain connection grew during her 17 years of experience working with children, adolescents, and adults. Thank you, Jennifer, for joining us, and thank you all again for making time. Dr. Gibson, I'll leave it to you to take it away from here. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, so we're here to talk about the Mediterranean diet for Crohn's and ulcerative colitis. And we have a really exciting panel. So let's start by asking the question, how would you rate your current knowledge of the Mediterranean diet right now for Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis? 0, you don't know anything at all, to 10, extremely knowledgeable. So go ahead and vote. We'll come back to that question later on and see if we improved. So okay, so we've got really a wide range of results here. 17% 0, we hope to improve that, and only 1% at 10, so many of you somewhere in the middle. Okay, so we'll move on. I want to acknowledge the people who have done a lot of the work that I'm going to talk to you about today, and that does include Dr. Natasha Haskey, who's going to speak after. I'm going to show some of her work because she's a registered dietitian. She's going to talk about some of the practical applications of the Mediterranean diet. But here are all the wonderful folks that have been in my lab over the years. And it really takes a huge amount of effort to find out anything in science. And so I really want to acknowledge all of these really hardworking, talented individuals. And of course, Crohn's and Colitis Canada for funding much of the research that I'm going to show you today. So inflammatory bowel disease, including Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis, is a chronic inflammatory condition. And this happens in the digestive tract. And there are many factors that are involved, including environmental factors that we don't totally understand, and of course, genetic factors too. But some of the environmental factors that I want to focus in on, because we focus a lot on environmental factors in my research lab, but today I'm going to focus on the dietary part of that. You have to understand, though, even from a basic perspective, what is the immune system? And if you have IBD, you know that the immune system isn't working for you. It's working against you. It causes the symptoms and it causes a lot of pain, causes the damage. So you might think about inflammation as being somewhat of a negative thing. But the reality is that inflammation is something that we need to survive. The whole role of the inflammatory response in the mammalian system is to detect and respond to pathogens or anything that is invading, as well as cancer. So we need inflammation. It is something that we've evolved with for survival. And it's very, very complex. So sometimes we think that inflammation is our enemy, especially in chronic inflammatory conditions like IBD. But the reality is that it's just a loss of the regulation of inflammation. So inflammation is very, very complex, and we tend to bin it all as a negative thing, but we do need it, and it is very helpful, including for some of our healing responses that we need to have once we have damaging inflammation. There are consequences to this immune dysfunction, of course, and that does include IBD, but a whole bunch of other chronic inflammatory conditions, some of which are comorbid with IBD. We can appreciate now that type 2 diabetes or metabolic dysfunction can be comorbid with IBD. Allergies, cardiovascular disease, Alzheimer's disease, these all have chronic inflammation as the root cause. And so we tend to think, or maybe get persuaded by popular media saying that we need to be anti-inflammatory, and we need to have an anti-inflammatory diet. Anything that can decrease our inflammation. And I kind of like to look at it as we shouldn't be looking for something anti-inflammatory, but more like something that promotes balanced inflammation. Right? So there is a lot of words out there that you can read in the media, but we have to really think and appreciate that inflammation has to work for us and not against us like it is in IBD. The other part of the story is, of course, the gut microbiome. This is a term that's been used quite widely in media, so you've probably heard about it. And that gut microbiome is really just this massive collection of microbes that lives on our skin, in our bodies. And the biggest source of them is, in fact, in our intestine. And these microbes have a whole bunch of little things that it can secrete and on the cell surface that communicates with your immune system. So these things are hand in hand, these microbes, with our immune system. And when they are balanced together, they're communicating well with each other, then it's a mutualistic relationship. But when we have an imbalance in our immune system, or perhaps we don't have the right microorganisms present in our intestine, this is when things can get dysregulated. And this can be problematic in the context of IBD. There's quite a lot of evidence to support that the wrong gut microbiome or the wrong microbes that are present in that gut microbiome can drive some of the disease and symptoms like damaging inflammation in a genetically susceptible individual. So there's been a lot of research to try to figure out, well, what does a healthy microbiome do? And we do understand that a healthy microbiome has a really important role. And in fact, this is a really nice graph taken by the Sonnenberg lab to show in graph A, when we have a good microbiome that's working for us and not against us, it's very, very important in regulating not only our immune system, but also our metabolism. And when we become more westernized, or when our microbiome starts to look not so healthy, typically we tend to call this a dysbiotic state or dysbiosis. The microbiome starts to change some of the host responses. That might look like we have more inflammation. We start to store too many calories, and that works against us. We don't have a functional barrier. We don't make the good metabolites that we need to restore inflammation. And so our microbiome, as it turns, I'll call westernized for the moment, it means that it's not performing at its top capacity. So there's a wonderful hypothesis paper built on a lot of evidence by Kaplan in 2017, published in Gastroenterology, to support that there is this increasing trend of IBD in industrialized countries. Since the 19th century, and in industrializing countries, or countries that are newly industrialized since the 20th century. So this strongly indicates that there's something going on in the environment. It's not just all genetics. And that's why there tends to be a focus on diet, because this is something that appears to be obvious that could affect our microbes. Now, when I started my research lab in 2010, I started to focus on lipids. And I focus on lipids because I thought they were really interesting from the point of view that they had been criticized for decades, but yet they are essential to life. It's very confusing at that point in time. High fat diet was not considered good. And, the ketogenic diet wasn't quite out yet. Now there's even more confusion with that being added to the literature. But we do know that lipids are essential for our development, our survival. It's the one of 3 macronutrients that we need to survive. Very important in our hormones, our brain and mental health, and of course for controlling inflammation. And as we and others have shown, also predicting the gut microbiome. So there's a lot of controversy in fat. And the question sort of became really early on in my research program, well, what is a Western diet anyway? And over time, I've sort of defined it along with many others that a Western diet pattern is really characterized by high polyunsaturated omega-6 fatty acids, because it's typically in vegetable oils that we all tend to cook with in North America. Highly processed meat, sweetened beverages, environmental contaminants is something that we need to consider, and a lot of food additives like emulsifiers. And there's also this reduction of protective foods, including fruits, vegetables, not tending to have lots of fish in the Western diet. And so this is sort of how I've defined it. Um, and, there's a lot of controversy surrounding fats still, I would say, today. And so I'm going to try to get through some of the data to get to the scientific facts about what could these fats be doing actually for inflammation in the gut. We do know that from looking at all of the global data for microbiomes in infants, that diet is a really, really strong predictor of the type of microbes that occupy the intestine. And so we know that, again, that the gut microbes are hand in hand with the immune system. And so we've also understood from my research lab that when we have a disease-associated gut microbiota, this can derail immunity. And this can, in fact, influence disease susceptibility in different periods of life because of this altered host microbe symbiosis. And this is something that I focused really early on in my research lab. So I'm not going to go through a lot of that data, but I am going to get to the Mediterranean diet. But all of these studies really led to the hypothesis that the Mediterranean diet would most likely be beneficial for ulcerative colitis, as well as Crohn's disease. Let's start by looking at the relative priority of consumption of dietary fats in North America. On my left-hand side, this is the American Heart Association. And we really want to eat a lot of these polyunsaturated fatty acids. High in omega-3 because they're cardioprotective. And then the next priority would be this omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acid, which in fact, North Americans have done a really good job of adding that to their diet because we consume quite a bit of it. And then monounsaturated fatty acids, which is really rich in olive oil, actually comes after this. And then we should avoid saturated fats as much as we can. The Canadian dietary recommendations are somewhat similar, about 20 to 35% of total energy from fat, where 5 to 10% of this comes from that omega-6. So that's the priority fatty acid to eat. And we don't have any existing guidelines on monounsaturated fats as well as saturated fat, but I think we all have an understanding that we don't really want to have too much saturated fat in our diets. And so we looked at these and its role in colitis. We did use rodent models, and I recognize that mice are not men or women, but it did inform us for our ulcerative colitis study in patients. So I feel like I can share these lessons with you, and that it's valuable information. So what we learned was that the check mark here, olive oil, which is rich in monounsaturated fatty acid, is protective. Again, there was no guidelines on that, and it wasn't a priority fatty acid for the American Food Guide. But actually, out of all of these things, it was the best. We also learned that fish oil, surprisingly, was really only beneficial when it was mixed with saturated fat. It was actually detrimental when we mixed it with polyunsaturated fats. We learned that milk fat does induce inflammation. Yes, it does, but it also induces several healing responses. And so that's an important distinction from the vegetable oils that are really dominating in our diet right now. And in fact, they are the priority fatty acid for us to eat in North America. It was the vegetable oils rich in omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acids. These are the ones that drove the most damaging immune responses in the absence of those healing responses. And so from all this, I had learned that potentially it was a blend that was going to be more important because, of course, we eat blends of diets, we eat patterns. We don't just focus in on one or two things. We shouldn't. We want to have a variety and a diversity of things that we consume in our diet. And this is when Natasha actually came to me. And I was really happy that she did, because I don't think I would have undergone the clinical trial without her. And together we came up with the idea that most likely if we combined a blend of olive oil, some saturated fat and fish oil, but really kept a low omega-6 PUFA diet, that this would probably be protective against colitis. And really this just looked like the Mediterranean fat blend. This is sort of classic. And at that point in time, nobody had studied the Mediterranean diet yet in IBD, but in other disease conditions like cardiovascular disease and diabetes, it seemed to be protective. There didn't seem to be anything negative about this diet. And so we went with that. And essentially, the first message I want to tell you is that fat isn't always the enemy. And the reality is that the detriments of the fat in our diet is probably from the types of fatty acids that we consume more than the amount of calories that we consume from fat. I should say that all of our diets are not that high in fat. They're not like a ketogenic fat diet, but they are higher than the Canadian Food Guide. So we do consider them a higher fat diet, which would be similar to the Mediterranean diet. And so when Natasha came into my lab, this is what we did is we sort of created this Mediterranean blend of fats, and we wanted to put it through our rodent models first before we went into humans, because in the humans, it would be obviously a lot more complicated because you don't just eat fat, we eat patterns. And so we made this 40% fat diet that was really rich in monounsaturated fat from olive oil, had some saturated fat and omega-3, but was really limited in the omega-6. And we tested this in a model of spontaneous colitis. So that means that this rodent, anyways in life, over time, will develop colitis. And this is just a method in which we as scientists can evaluate if what we give them for food is protective or detrimental. And I'm not going to go through the data, but I do want to show you the graphical abstract. And if anyone is interested, it is a published study that you can go and look at. But the conclusion really was that the Mediterranean light fat blend did protect against colitis. And I'll just draw your attention. There's lots of details here that you can look at if you're really science savvy. But if you just look at the green right here, the Mediterranean fat blend was the best. It did protect against damaging immune responses, but it also had really good metabolic responses because the immune system affects metabolism too, right? It's a whole field called immunometabolism. And of course, when we have inflammation going awry, we can also expect that metabolically we're not perfect as well. And so our olive oil group, it did have some mild inflammation and some metabolic consequences, it was the second best diet. So it wasn't as good as the Mediterranean blend. The blend was more beneficial than just taking straight olive oil. Whereas corn oil, which is the one that is rich in the omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acids, again, the fatty acids that we're supposed to be consuming, it had the worst chronic inflammation, and it had really severe metabolic consequences. And milk fat actually did better than that diet. So milk fat also had inflammation damage, but it had wonderful metabolic responses and some repair mechanisms. And so it was the blend that included some of these saturated fats, as well as the omega-3, and of course, the olive oil that was the best to support gut health in our scientific rodent models. So what about in humans? Well, we got some help from some gastroenterologists, including Dr. Dealman, Dr. Jacobson, and Dr. Singh. And we went ahead and looked at the Mediterranean diet pattern, and we compared it to what we called the Canadian habitual diet, or the Canadian dietary pattern. So Canadians who just eat whatever they eat in their normal time. And we looked at disease activity, compliance. We looked at a whole bunch of different things. It's published as well. So if you're really interested, you can go and look at that. But I'll just give you the high level, really important information to get from this. Number one, this was a great diet to comply to. So the ulcerative colitis patients very much complied with this diet. They enjoyed it. And we could show that they were compliant to this diet by looking at a total score. So it was very quantitative. And we also looked at the healthy eating index, and we could see that the Mediterranean diet, after 12 weeks of this diet, had improved significantly their healthy eating index. So it was something easy that they could comply to. They enjoyed it, and it improved their healthy eating index score. When we looked at the really important things like inflammation in the Mediterranean diet, we could conclude a few things. In A, we looked at total partial Mayo score. And so the higher that score, the more disease activity one has. We can see that in the blue, the Mediterranean diet stayed after 12 weeks at a low score, whereas the Canadian habitual diet increased their score. So what we can say is that the Mediterranean diet, there was a significance in patients who could maintain their remission. And there was a significant improvement in their disease activity. And we could pinpoint that to fecal calprotectin levels. So if you look at C and D, we can see that when consuming the Mediterranean diet for 12 weeks, the fecal calprotectin stayed low. But with the Canadian habitual diet, it started to increase. And so again, that meant that the Mediterranean diet was really good at helping these ulcerative colitis patients maintain their remission. That's not to say that the Mediterranean diet cured their disease, but everybody has to eat. And so everybody should know what's the best diet to help maintain their remission. It's important to note that all of these individuals are still taking their medication. And so what we could conclude from this graphical abstract is that the Mediterranean diet, despite it being higher in fat, as well as very rich in fiber, it was well tolerated by ulcerative colitis patients, and it could be considered a good diet to help patients stay in remission alongside their frontline therapy drugs. We also showed differences in the gut microbiota and metabolites, and those are all the things that are most likely helping that fecal calprotectin stay low. But I'm not going to show you too much of that data because I know you really want to know how can you eat this Mediterranean diet. And before I pass you off to Natasha, who's really instrumental in helping guide all of this research, is that the Mediterranean diet really is a diet that is protective, whereas the Western diet, like the Canadian diet, is really a diet that tends to promote poor gut health and most likely exacerbates the symptoms of IBD. But it's probably not just the Mediterranean diet, okay? The Indian diet, the Asian diet, all of these pyramids have something in common. And that is the fact that it's really rich in whole foods. There's not a whole lot of processed foods present in any of these diets. And when I studied this Mediterranean diet, it really got me thinking, because I was also doing a study looking at the gut microbiome in the Indian population compared to Indian immigrants and Indo-Canadians. And I realized that the Indian diet, it's not the same as the Mediterranean diet, but they have something in common, and that is that it's just rich in whole foods. And so I want to share some unpublished data with you just to sort of, get you thinking. I know this is a very, very terrible graph to look at, and it's not published, so I probably shouldn't be showing it to you, but I really wanted to, because what we can see from this graph is that if you look at all the green dots, those are all the Indians and their gut microbiome living in India. Every dot refers to an individual, and every dot refers to their entire gut microbiome, okay? And if you look over on the other side where you have a bunch of yellow dots, those are the Canadians with a European background. And what I have highlighted there in red is a thing called processed food. And that is because what is driving these microbes in the microbiome is the presence of processed foods, completely absent from the Indian cohort. And you can see in purple, those are the Indian immigrants, so people who immigrated to Canada. The processed food isn't also driving their diets, but the Indo-Canadians in red is really overlapping everywhere, including with the European Canadians. And so they changed their diet. They started adopting this really convenient diet, which is very rich in processed foods. And you can see this from this graph here. Again, this is unpublished, but we can see that the average Indian in India, 12% of their daily intake of calories is actually from processed foods. That's very little. Whereas the Indo-Canadian is like 61%. And the European Canadian and European immigrant, they're all very high in processed foods. So processed food intake progressively might change or westernize our microbiome. And this might have something to do with it. So it might not just be the fact that it's a Mediterranean diet. And so I want to leave you with that thought, is that potentially it's really any diet low in processed foods that might support disease management. And so we have to start looking at food a little bit differently. For example, canned food could be considered processed. Maybe many of you don't think that, but it is considered processed. It's not an ultra processed, but it's still processed compared to fresh food. Granola bars, those are processed instead of just a handful of nuts and seeds. And so maybe we need to start thinking about that a little bit more in the West. And with that, I'm going to now hand it over to Dr. Natasha Haskey to tell you more about how to take the Mediterranean diet as a dietary change.
Hey, so thank you, Deanna, for providing such a nice overview of the science. And I think what my role is today is to really delve into these practical recommendations and how you can actually implement the Mediterranean diet into your lifestyle. So I'm excited to say that there have been some excellent advancements in the area of diet and inflammatory bowel disease. And really, I feel like it's time to move away from this messaging that diet does not matter when it comes to IBD. We're certainly seeing more options available to patients, but I do want to acknowledge that it's not a one size fits all approach, but nor are medications. So not medications work for all. So not all diets are going to work for all. We need to consider that every patient is unique. It depends on your state of disease, whether you have active disease versus remission. You may have food intolerances, and there's also lifestyle factors. So multiple options often need to be explored with everyone. But working with a registered dietitian that is trained in IBD can help you safely incorporate dietary changes alongside medication to help manage some of those symptoms, help with healing, as well as reduce inflammation. So my poll question is, what would you want to get from modifying your diet when living with IBD? Do you want it to help control your symptoms? Would it be helpful to reduce inflammation? Are you concerned about nutrition deficiencies? Are you concerned about weight? Do you just want to be healthier or have more energy? So please feel free to answer the poll. So while you're doing that, I'll come back to that. But when we're looking at dietary therapy, and before I jump into the Mediterranean diet, I do want to actually mention that some of the diets, there are some other whole food diet strategies out there that have been tested in inflammatory bowel disease with varying levels of evidence. Whether it be the specific carbohydrate diet or the IBD aid diet, or even the Crohn's disease exclusion diet, or some of them, these diets can be quite restrictive and have explicit rules regarding what can be included in the diet and what can be excluded. And to be honest, compliance is essential for the success. Some of these diets, you need to be mindful that they do take substantial amount of time. Could be a financial commitment as well as lifestyle commitments. And these approaches are more suited for individuals that are highly motivated. But with that said, it can be done. And so I just want to highlight this particular website called Nutrition Therapy for IBD that is supported by a variety of medical professionals, dietitians, gastroenterologists. And this is a nice resource if you are interested in exploring some other types of diet. I do want to mention that I'm also actively involved in clinical trials, and another diet that may be coming down the road soon is called a Crohn's disease therapeutic diet. And we are recruiting right now and would love any help from patients out there. So if you're in Calgary or Edmonton, have active Crohn's disease and are interested in trialing our diet, please feel free to contact me and I'll get you in touch with our coordinators. So there is a difference when it does come to symptom management. This is where the low-fat, low-FODMAP diet comes in. Some people find it helpful to remove various foods like lactose, dairy, or gluten, and just avoiding some of those trigger foods. These particular diets are not meant to reduce inflammation. Sometimes they just can help individuals manage their symptoms. Again, they're highly restrictive diets and can, if followed for long term, can result in nutrition deficiencies because these food groups provide essential nutrients. And I'm also part of my postdoctoral work with Dr. Maitri Raman is looking at intermittent fasting in Crohn's disease patients. So if you're a Crohn's disease patient that's living in the Okanagan and dealing with being overweight, we are recruiting for that particular study as well. Now, jumping into the Mediterranean diet, the one thing I do want to mention is that the Mediterranean diet has not been studied in the setting of induction of remission, it is truly what we found to be helpful in maintaining remission. And so I'm just going to bring up the IBD food pyramid. And since I joined Dr. Maitri Raman's team, I've flipped over to trying to use this IBD food pyramid because I do think it summarizes the scientific evidence in a nice way. And I'll talk about the healthy fats. I've convinced our team that we need to relook at that piece in this pyramid, but I think it's a nice way to break down the Mediterranean diet. I can give you the practical recommendations along with the scientific evidence. So, to no surprise, we do highly recommend the increased consumption of fruits and vegetables. And the rationale for that is that fruits and vegetables contain important vitamins, minerals, but even perhaps more important is the fiber and some of the antioxidants and flavonoids. Unfortunately, these foods tend to be underconsumed in patients living with IBD due to fear of eating. We've certainly given recommendations in the past that may have contributed to the decreased intake in these different types of foods. But practically, we can use guidelines for remission versus that during a flare. So when you're in remission, generally, your gut has been healed. It tends to work a little bit better. So it can probably tolerate more fruits and vegetables and leafy greens. But when you're in a flare state, some of these foods can be very uncomfortable. So I'm just providing some suggestions here, like bananas, fruit purees, peeling fruits and vegetables, blending soups, that can really help with tolerance. And so when we go back to this piece around flavonoids, antioxidants, we really are pushing the color, trying to have that rainbow on your plate because different fruits and vegetables provide different types of nutrients that are important. So, for example, you may consider to get your vegetables in a day, trying to have 2 different colors at lunch and at supper. So what that might look like is having sweet potato as well as, say, a garden salad or spinach with some carrots. So that provides those different kinds of colors. And when it comes to fruit, aiming for 2 to 4 servings a day. So that's trying to incorporate more fruit at your meals and snacks. That can really help curb that sweet tooth. But it also provides the important dietary fiber sources. But what if you have strictures or you're dealing with an ostomy? Well, for those types of situations, it's a very simple strategy, but we often eat really, really quickly. So in these circumstances, or even everybody, trying to chew your food better, chewing it so that it does break down some of these fibers so that we're not gulping our food down. Take some time to enjoy your meals, but also cooking these foods, pureeing them can help removing the peel and removing some of those nuts and seeds. Shouldn't be really doing stringy type foods like celery in this situation, just due to the risk of creating a blockage. And I really love this particular slide. It was shared with me today by a fellow colleague, Laura Manning. And she really shows here that different types of fruits and vegetables can be incorporated into your diet depending on what stage of where your disease state is at. So in a flare, and if you want to include some of those leafy greens, blend them into a soup, blend them into a smoothie. You're still getting the fiber, but it's just more easily digested, and you're still getting those nutrients. Well, when you're transitioning out of a flare, you can do more of the cooked, sauteed type vegetables. And when you're in remission and the gut is healed, you can go back to those salads that are so wonderful to enjoy. The next phase of the pyramid is really focusing on starchy food and legumes. And the rationale for that is that there's been some interesting research around what we call resistant starch. And resistant starch it acts like a dietary fiber source. So reaches the colon, produces healthy substances like butyrate, which feeds the colon cells. And as a result of that, we're encouraging the intake of at least 2 cups of these starchy foods a day. And it's often not a difficult thing for people because things like white rice, potatoes, noodles, oats, things like that, they provide that nice form of soluble fiber, but also this resistant starch. And what's unique about resistant starch is that when we cook it, cool it, and reheat it, so think leftover rice, and when we eat it, it creates that resistant starch, which has been shown to have some health benefits. Now, legumes also provide a wonderful source of soluble fiber, but the thing I often hear is that, they give me gas, they make me bloat. And I think what the problem is that I think we're trying to increase our legume consumption really quickly when we're not used to it. So all of a sudden we'll have this chili, chocolate full of navy beans, every kind of bean out there, eat it, and then we feel sick. And this is not just unique to the IBD population. It's Canadians, Americans in general. So I think what we need to do is really start slowly with legumes. So it could be as simple as adding a tablespoon of something like chickpeas, if you're in remission, to a salad. See how you do with that. If you don't do great with a tablespoon, even a teaspoon, and then gradually start increasing your intake. And the other thing I want to mention is that fiber is important in IBD. We need to get rid of that message that fiber needs to be restricted because fiber comes in all different types of sources. And I do want to acknowledge that we are doing a really poor job in Canada in getting enough fiber into our diet. The general population is nowhere near meeting these guidelines. And I'm showing the Canadian guidelines at 38 grams per day for males and females being 25. We're probably more in the range of 10 grams. And that's probably even very similar in our patients that are living with inflammatory bowel disease. But I kind of partially feel responsible for that because early in my career, this is exactly what I was recommending, that, to treat IBD, we remove fiber. The other thing that ties into what Deanna was talking about and these ultra-processed foods is that they have these emulsifiers in them. And what we're seeing is that increased intake of these emulsifiers has been associated with increased risk of Crohn's disease. Secondly, we do know that it affects the gut microbes and the intestinal lining. So I'm listing the emulsifiers that have been implicated in this. And if there's one recommendation today, if you don't feel very motivated to make a ton of changes, just if you can reduce your consumption of some of these ultra-processed foods, it'll make I do believe it would make a big difference to not only your gut health, but I've also seen it when patients reduce that intake of some of these processed foods, they do end up having less symptoms. So cooking more healthy meals. Healthy proteins. So what we recommend for inflammatory bowel disease is to stick to the white meats. So the chicken and turkey, fish, because we have seen in large scale studies where they follow people over time that increased red meat seems to be associated with inflammatory bowel disease. And so we are recommending limiting that red meat to 8 ounces. The guideline here says once per week, but even if you could have it every couple of weeks. And the other thing that's really, really important is getting that fatty fish. And the fatty fish provides that omega-3, the omega-3 fatty acids. It seems that we do not get the same benefit from an omega-3 supplement. So it really needs to come from those fish sources. And when it comes to processed meats, if you can eliminate them, that's probably your best bet. But if you have to include them in your diet, sticking to only an ounce a week. I want to mention a little bit about nuts and seeds. And nuts and seeds, like many foods, fall into different categories. And in this situation, the nuts and seeds can be a healthy protein source. And one of the key components of the Mediterranean diet is really having approximately an ounce of different types of nuts incorporated into your diet at least 5 times a week. Again, if you're in a more active state, nut butters will work just as well. And we're talking nuts and seeds that are actually not, what was I going to say? Nuts and seeds that are not, have been fried and salted. We're talking the natural state of these actual nuts. And when it comes to seeds, some of those hemp seeds, chia seeds can be a nice additional source of omega-3 fatty acids. We don't convert it as readily as, say, some of the fatty fish sources, but if you're trying to work at getting more into your diet, that could be a potential option. I think Deanna covered the piece around fats nicely. We really need to change our perception around fat. All fat isn't bad. It really is about the type of fat. So when I was counseling patients for our research study, I really emphasized the intake of a good quality olive oil. What that looks like is, and how much, is 3 tablespoons a day. And it sounds like a lot, but it's not. So that includes cooking. You can make your own salad dressing. That's another option. You might want to dip your bread in some nice olive oil. And there's even some nice flavored olive oils. So things like lemon flavored olive oil, orange flavored olive oil, which can nicely be incorporated into something like a Greek yogurt. Add some fruit to that Greek yogurt. And I can honestly say that the patients I was working with actually quite enjoyed this. When it comes to avocado oil, we don't know the quality of the avocado oils out there. So I would recommend consuming the avocado itself and do what we can. I think it's really important to do what we can to eliminate that corn oil, safflower, sunflower oil, which is heavily integrated into our ultra processed foods. It's rampant in our diet, hard to decrease, but if we can reduce those highly processed foods, that will certainly help. Now, dairy products, I mean, we have seen a role in our research around the importance of the dairy fat in helping, I guess, providing that balanced inflammation. Now, not everyone can tolerate them, and I think it takes a little bit of investigation. Now, are you not tolerating it because you're reacting to the dairy protein, or is it actually the lactose? So, and some people can tolerate a little bit of lactose, but if they go overboard, say they had lasagna and then they decided to have a glass of milk and maybe something after dinner that contained dairy and just loaded themselves with lactose, then obviously they're in the washroom and have pain the next day. But perhaps spreading those dairy products out throughout the day, some of the fermented dairy, so for example, yogurt, kefir, tend to actually have lower amounts of lactose than, say, other options like a glass of milk. Skim milk actually has the highest amount of lactose. And there are lactose tablets that you can try to reduce that, help you digest that lactose. So certainly not everyone feels comfortable with this, but I do want to mention that there are some health benefits to dairy products. So if you do like them, don't feel like you have to start excluding them because you've seen some information on the internet or someone has told you that it's bad for you. Lastly, I think it's important to, I just want to dispel this myth that the Mediterranean diet is extremely expensive. You can go about this in a different way in that you can purchase in bulk. So a lot of these foods on the Mediterranean diet can be inexpensively purchased in bulk. Another thing to be conscious of is purchasing foods that are local and in season. They'll be at a reduced price. And a lot of these things you can freeze for the future if you get them at a good price. There's nothing wrong with consuming frozen fruits and vegetables, especially this time of year in Canada. Our access to some of these foods some of these frozen fruits and vegetables may have more nutrient value than some of the fresh because they've sat so long in various refrigeration conditions. Frozen fish could be an option. You can look for deals, use coupons. Costco has some nice options, but avoid those packaged processed meal options. Planning ahead so you don't waste a lot of food can be helpful. And using your own salad dressings, making your own salad dressings can be cost effective as well. And then you're getting rid of a lot of those emulsifiers. We don't have to buy name brand foods. A lot of stores have their own store brand, which are just as healthy. And one thing, I often think about myself, and I know I'm privileged, but sometimes I'm going to Starbucks and purchasing that Starbucks or buying coffee out. And if we're thinking about where we want to put our money, perhaps we make our own coffee at home, save that money, put that money towards a good quality olive oil. So just want to finish up with some nice resources. Crohn's Colitis Canada, Crohn's Colitis Foundation of America, Nutrition Therapy for IBD, all have wonderful resources to help support you on this journey, as well as does Old Ways. This is what I used for my particular study. And they actually have some wonderful culturally adapted resources, which I think is important. And there's many, many cookbooks, and the one I'm showing here is just one example. And I've already seen this question come up in the question box. And as I sit here and I tell you that, see a dietitian, we realize access can sometimes be a problem, but I am myself, for example, and a number of other of us dietitians are working with the platform of LifeMD, where we are offering nutrition services. We work with IBD patients, we work with people that have digestive conditions, and the platform is really more than just nutrition. It does help with mental health and wellness, physical activity, yoga programs, you name it. So if you're interested in giving this a try, please contact your doctor. You can try the platform for a little bit, because some of our patients that are on biologics, their patient support programs also support this program. So you can have access to a dietitian. And with that, I'd be happy to pass things over to Jennifer. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Haskey and Dr. Gibson. And thank you to all of you for allowing me to share with you my lived experience with inflammatory bowel disease. My name is Jennifer Bennett. I was diagnosed with ulcerative colitis at the age of 23 and have been battling this chronic disease for the past 18 years. I've been involved with Crohn's and Colitis Canada for the past 18 years at my local chapter, and I'm also a Gutsy peer mentor. I'm happily married to the love of my life and have twin boys. Together, we enjoy spending time outdoors with our mini boardoodle named Blue, hiking, skiing, biking, fishing, and much more. During the early days of my initial diagnosis of inflammatory bowel disease, I was told the inflammation was only found in the lower rectum, known as proctitis. Unfortunately, life changed dramatically for me in a very short period of time. I was admitted to the hospital 1 month after my diagnosis. At that time, they performed another colonoscopy and determined that my level of inflammation had increased. Most of my large bowel was extremely sick. During the next 3 years, I spent most of my time in and out of the hospital. I could no longer continue with my profession as an educator in the school system and was forced to make the difficult decision to step aside and focus on my health. I was extremely sick, weak, and unable to maintain a healthy lifestyle of eating, exercising, and socializing with friends and family. After trying numerous forms of anti-inflammatory medications, the doctors decided it was best I have a total colectomy, meaning I had my colon removed, with an ileostomy, which is an opening in my abdomen. After that, my life began to change, as I could tolerate food again. My strength started to regain, and my overall health started to improve. However, I was still anemic and had extensive wounds with tunneling that required 5 months of daily visits to the wound care nurse for packing and dressing changes. After discharge from my surgery, it was recommended that I eat only low-fiber foods for the first few weeks. I struggled with hydration and maintaining my electrolyte balance. Slowly, my bowel began to heal, and I could tolerate new foods every week. Life was starting to move in the right direction. After 1.5 years, my colorectal surgeon decided my bowel was ready for the J-pouch surgery. My diet after the surgery went back to the recommendations that were given to me when I had an ileostomy. I maintained good health for around 15 years. Unfortunately, I started to show signs of inflammation once again, and I was diagnosed with chronic pouchitis, which is inflammation of the J pouch. There was no huge improvement after being on medication for several weeks. So I started to do my own research on healing the gut microbiome, focusing on following an anti-inflammatory diet. After reading about the benefits of a Mediterranean diet being shown to reduce inflammation, I started to read more on whole foods and omega-3 fatty acids. I knew my body needed something more than what I was giving them at the time. Every day or so, I would introduce one food at a time and document using my journal how I felt after each meal in terms of bowel movements, pain, abdominal swelling, nausea, and overall well-being. I would eliminate any trigger foods that caused problems in the past. After being on a Mediterranean diet for about 2 weeks, I started to see small changes. Every day, I would keep these principles in mind while planning my meals or snacks. I would consume more fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, nuts and seeds, and heart-healthy fats. On the other hand, I would consume less processed foods, added sugars, and refined grains. Next slide. To walk you through a brief overview of how my diet looks daily, I'm able to drink 8 to 10 glasses of water to maintain hydration. When you have a J pouch, you can easily get dehydrated. Next, I choose 5 or more vegetables of fruits daily, and some of those I found to be gut-friendly based on my personal experience are listed on the screen. These include avocados, bananas, strawberries, dates, figs, kale, spinach, and many more. I've also listed some snacks that I usually have, which are nuts, seeds, and nut butter. Next slide. As for the legumes that I add to most of my meals, these are beans, peas, lentils, and chickpeas, as well as oats, brown rice, whole wheat bread, and pasta for whole grains. When selecting healthy proteins for the day, I choose foods such as salmon, trout, tuna, mackerel, shrimp, chicken, and eggs. I also cook and consume healthy fats like extra virgin olive oil, olives, avocado, and I make sure to limit the amount of dairy, which is cheese, yogurt, or milk. If I were to eat either of these foods, it would be plain Greek yogurt, almond, or coconut milk. Lastly, I eat very little to none of the recommended foods to be excluded in a Mediterranean diet. And these are listed on the screen here. Next slide. As added sugars, I avoid candies, ice cream, table sugar, syrup, and baked goods. And as refined grains, I avoid white bread, pasta, tortillas, chips, and crackers. I also limit my consumption of trans fats found in margarine, fried foods, and other processed foods, including fast food, convenience meals, microwave popcorn, granola bars, and processed meats, like processed sausages, hot dogs, deli meats, beef jerkies. Making these life changes had an incredible change in my IBD symptoms and overall well-being. My energy levels and ability to digest foods have been so good that I don't want to eat the foods that I mentioned to limit or avoid. The implications of eating these foods on my body is not worth how it makes me feel in the end. Eating high fiber foods helps me feel satisfied for longer periods and less likely to snack. I've been on this diet for the past 2 years and have seen a huge difference in my IBD symptoms, especially since it helps me with digestion and absorption and feeling less joint pain and discomfort. Next slide. Despite all of this, I want to clarify that this is not a cure for inflammatory bowel disease. This should be used in conjunction with medication that is recommended by our gastroenterologist. I follow the guidelines presented to me by my specialists, along with daily exercise, maintaining healthy sleep, and maintaining low stress levels. I encourage others who struggle with this disease to try this combination only if it is recommended for you by your healthcare providers, including your dietitian if you have one. Thank you for listening to my story.
Thanks very much, Jennifer, for sharing that with us, and some really great advice as well for the group to take with them from today. And thank you, Deanne and Natasha, also for your great presentations. Now we will kick off the Q&A session. We did get a lot of questions that were asked live, but we are going to try to prioritize the questions that were asked ahead of time when everyone registered. And then we'll do our best to get to a few more that were asked during the broadcast here. Again, we cannot answer any questions about, specific medical situations. So we'll try to keep it sort of high level, more general focused, and we'll get started with the first question. So we have three great panel members here today. So I think what we'll do is, if it's okay, Natasha and Deanna and Jennifer, I'll just start it off with Deanna to answer the first question. And then if there are any other comments from Natasha or Jennifer, then you can add to it. And then we can maybe just go with that flow if that works for you. Deanna, if you don't have any comments for the first question, you can just pass and hand it off to Natasha as well. Can people living with an ostomy or strictures or short bowel syndrome follow the Mediterranean diet? Thank you.
Yeah, so Natasha actually did mention this, so I'll just pass it to her. She's already thought about this.
Yeah, I think I would mention that we do need more research in this particular area, especially when it comes to diet for those living with ostomy. Right now, we're really basing it on people's perceptions, and we'd like to do some more research to find out what can and cannot be helpful for those living with ostomy. I think I covered the strictures. Same with short bowel syndrome. That's a tricky one. I really do not want to make any recommendations today. I think it's really important, if you do have short bowel syndrome, to connect with a dietitian, because there are definitely nutrient concerns.
Next question, please. Which food supplements, including probiotics and prebiotics, would you recommend for a person living with IBD?
I actually hate supplements, to be really honest, because I think you should just eat the whole food if you can. And I do want to make a really disclaimer here that I co-founded a company looking at genetically engineered probiotics. It is, of my opinion, when I look through the scientific literature and my own studies in my research lab, that probiotics have a very hard time surviving in the IBD gut. Think about it. Inflammation is designed to kill bacteria, and we are flooding the IBD gut that's full of inflammation, full of bacteria that may or may not be viable because it's an unregulated space as of now. So in my point of view, there are no appropriate probiotics currently available to be taken for IBD. Prebiotics, I know that Natasha has a lot of expertise in this area just from being a registered dietitian. So I'm going to let her answer that part, please.
Yeah, I think I'm in agreement with you, Deanna, about the probiotics, but I'm also, when it comes to prebiotics, we've got so much work we can do when it comes to just changing our diet. If we change our diet to something like a more Mediterranean diet, you are going to get those prebiotics in it. And what comes along with eating the food is a whole other host of benefits. So it's not just the prebiotics, it's the antioxidants, it's the nutrients. So I really have to say I'm not a fan of supplementation either. And maybe that'll come in the future when we understand more about the microbiome in the gut.
Okay, thank you. Could you maybe provide some examples? I know you may have mentioned a few examples of how to get these into your diet by eating whole foods, but just wondering if maybe we could provide some examples for the audience.
Right. So the antioxidants, polyphenols, are examples of prebiotics. The resistant starch are examples of prebiotics. Um, I could go into a whole fiber story, but a lot of our fibers act as prebiotics because they aren't digested by the enzymes in the upper part of our digestive tract actually don't break these prebiotics down. It's the microbes.
Hmm.
So, yeah.
Hmm.
And that's what's producing those healthy substances. So, just sort of a high level
Okay.
overview. Yeah.
Okay, so I would suggest that people watch the recording for a refresher then on some of those recommendations. Thanks very much. Jennifer, have you tried using any sort of supplements or having any natural sources of probiotic or prebiotic in your diet?
Yeah, thank you for asking, Sarah. Actually went under a trial base for FMT, fecal microbiota transplant in McMaster University under Dr. Narula. And I was recommended at the time to take Visbiome, which is a 450 billion live bacteria, and I found it very beneficial. It's a part of my diet every day. I take 2 packets and have found this very beneficial. It's actually used for those who struggle with ulcerative colitis specifically and pouchitis, chronic pouchitis. So that's the reason why I take it. I also do take some supplements such as vitamin D, and I do try to take some omega 3s. If I find, especially if I'm traveling, I'm not able to take in the olive oil, or I'm on the road or things like that. If I'm noticing in my diet that I'm not able to get the amount of omega 3 that I really, or the fatty acids that I'm looking for, I try to supplement them in other ways. But I do agree with Dr. Haskey and Dr. Gibson. If we can take it in whole foods, 100%. Yes, that's where I go. For prebiotics, I eat a lot of applesauce daily. That's just something that I like to eat, and I just incorporate that wherever I can, especially these little squeezable packs that you can just throw in your car or you're on the road and just take them when you can. That's just a little tip from me.
Yeah, and I'll just chime in that, my perspective is scientific, right? And so there's always like the curve, right? For the people it works for and for the people it doesn't. And I just look at the average. So we've actually looked at Visbiome, which is formerly known as VSL3, just in our rodent models, and there really just isn't any colonization or survival in the IBD and inflamed gut. And there's also really no clinical data to support that would be effective for the average individual. But again, if something works for you, right, like it probably isn't going to cause harm either. So.
Okay, thank you. Next question, please. This is a good question because also we had this asked live. So for those that are vegetarian or a vegan, what would be some recommendations or tips for following the Mediterranean diet?
Yeah, so Old Ways actually has a pattern that's they've designed for vegetarians, not in particular vegans, but the thing about the Mediterranean diet is it's very plant forward. So it's just a matter of removing the uh, the red meat, the chicken. But I mean, we also have to be cautious that one of the number one, I would say a lot of Crohn's disease patients could be at risk for vitamin B12 deficiency. And if a vegetarian or vegan diet is not consumed properly, there is that risk. And also an appropriate vegetarian and vegan diet, because now we have access to a lot of packaged, processed, ultra processed vegan and vegetarian foods. And honestly, I do not think that's much better than actually consuming meat. I mean, there's a variety of reasons why people choose to go vegetarian or vegan, but it has to be planned well and not replacing it with some of these highly packaged processed foods and meats.
Yeah, that's a good point. There was a couple questions around tofu. and if that was of any like benefit in particular to this diet, but um, I guess that would be an option as well that they could supplement with.
Yes, that's right.
Okay, great. Deanna, did you have anything to add? Jennifer, did you have anything to add around this particular piece? No? Okay, thank you. Next question, please. Is allergy testing through blood work an effective tool to pinpoint trigger foods to avoid in IBD?
So from an immunology point of view, type 1 allergies or IgE allergies is typically how physicians would test, or testing would occur, is looking for these IgE dominant responses. And so you would have an IgE response, for example, to like shellfish or to some of these stronger allergens. But often food intolerances are just really different than, say, allergic responses to foods, right? And so those are two different things. And I think most certainly, if you think that you have actually allergies, like true allergies, that can sometimes be life-threatening, right? Like to a bee sting or something like that, right? Then of course having these blood work done is very effective. But there is some other information out there where there's some testing kits looking at a whole bunch of different food intolerances through a hair strand, claiming that cells that are metabolically active, we can know somehow how would you respond to a food allergen. And there's also some IgG testing out there, but the evidence scientifically doesn't really support the two that I just mentioned. So it would be really dependent on what you were looking at. So there is some value in that if you're doing classical allergy testing through blood work. Yes, but most often that's not necessarily going to tell you much about like your intolerances to foods.
Thank you. Next question, please. This one, I think I'll ask maybe Natasha first, and then Jennifer, if you have some advice to add as well, that would be great. Do you have any advice on how to sort of modify or recommend certain diets for teenagers? And this came through live as well, just looking for general advice.
Yeah, I hope Jennifer can help me. It's a tough population for sure. I guess when we think of teens, they're always hungry. They've got really high nutrient requirements. So the best thing you can do is kind of keep a pantry that's well stocked with Mediterranean like foods so that they, those grab and go type options. And you have control probably of your house at home. So removing some of those ultra processed foods when they're out and about, much less control. But again, maybe if there are those grab and go options, I'm thinking things like overnight oats, they'll do yogurt, having like the fruit washed and prepped sitting in the fridge are some options. But I think we don't always want to say that a teen isn't going to do this, because some some teens could be very motivated if they know it makes them feel better. So I'd love your feedback, Jennifer.
Yeah, thank you. Dr. Haskell, I agree with everything that you just suggested. But if I look back at my life, and I know I told you all that I was diagnosed at 23, I know that in my high school years, I certainly had trouble eating, say, processed foods and fast food outlets and things like that. If all my friends would go and eat, and I used to always come home and suffer and not really knowing the reasons why. So I think that if you start to introduce with them, like the Dr. Haskell said, having things ready and prepared, overnight oats are great. Having stuff in the fridge, kind of just grabbing their Ziplocs to go, and then they feel the benefits of how it makes them feel. if you're someone who suffers with inflammatory bowel disease, you quickly know that if you eat the wrong foods, it's not worth the outcome. So I think that they'll want to lean towards the foods that are going to make them feel better. And if they do want to treat themselves, if they consider it a treat by eating the foods that may harm them, they, I guess, may want to do it in the comfort of their own home. And then maybe that'll show them too that probably it wasn't worth it. So I love all the great ideas of having things ready for them to try, and just kind of sit down with them and say, you know, I'm making a grocery order for the week. I do a lot of my meal prepping on a Sunday, and I kind of think about how my week's going to look, and just incorporating them in that, and just saying, are there some things that you would like me to pick up? What are some things that worked last week? You know, what are some things that we could try new this week that is on the Mediterranean diet if you want to, you know, lean towards that diet. And I guess just incorporating them and making them have some ownership in that as well. So yeah, it's tricky, but I think that they'll make the smart decisions as well, because the outcomes are just so good on the gut. When you start to feel better, you're not going to want to go back.
Yeah, those are great points, Jennifer. Just, making them part of the process and the decision making and helping them really understand the impact of the food and how it can maybe trigger some of those symptoms that they ultimately don't want to have to deal with, for sure. Thanks very much. So I'm just mindful of time. We've got a few more minutes for maybe one or two more questions. So we'll advance to the next question, please. Okay. So maybe this one would be best suited for Natasha first, and then followed by the rest of the panel. What would be your advice on how an individual with Crohn's, or I'm going to suggest colitis here as well, so Crohn's or colitis, how they might go about incorporating beans into their diet without causing excessive gas? Natasha, I know you talked a little bit about this earlier on as well.
Yeah, just to re-emphasize, it really is about going slow and not having a whole bunch at once. It takes time for your digestive tract to adapt. The other thing you can try is it's called Beano. So what it does is it breaks down the substance that produces the gas called galacto-oligosaccharide. So you would consume that with a meal, can help some people. The other thing is that if you're comfortable and want to choose something like a canned bean, make sure they're low sodium. If you rinse them, you remove a lot of that galacto-oligosaccharide, so that can actually help with tolerance as well. But I'd be curious what Deanna and Jennifer have to say as well.
Dr. Haskey, I'm so happy that you mentioned Beano because it was the very first thing that came to my mind when I read this question. But I just wanted to make sure that I wasn't outstepping medical advice here, but someone with experience and someone who has gone through 3 bowel surgeries, so 2 different types of ileostomies, a loop and an ileostomy before the J pouch, and then the creation of the J pouch. I found in every single one of those surgeries, the recovery after that, I struggled a lot with gas and gas problems, which sometimes felt much like a blockage. So having Beano on hand, especially if you're going to have gassy foods, certainly take them beforehand. Or let's say that you weren't aware that something was gassy and you did have some of those discomfort pain afterwards, just having the Beano on hand is really life-changing. So thanks. I'm glad that it's recommended.
Yeah, I'll just mention you don't need a prescription to purchase it. So you can find it at pharmacies, health food stores, things like that.
Deanna, did you have anything to add? I thought maybe you had unmuted for a moment, but I'm not sure.
We're
I
good.
see you. Okay. Sounds good. Sounds good. Thank you. Okay, so I think we're gonna have our last well, I think maybe I'll just ask a quick question from the audience because it came up quite a bit, and then I'll ask this one. Is more so just around, are there any specific recommendations around olive oil? Like are there some that are better quality versus maybe some lower quality ones? Are, any specific recommendations around that?
It's a
either to
challenge.
Deanna or Natasha. Okay,
Yeah, like
okay.
yeah, when it
I was
comes
just gonna say it's like wine, right? Like, I mean,
Uh,
you could study olive oil and but
yeah.
I'll let Natasha give the really practical advice for Canada.
Yeah, when it comes to Canada, what's interesting is that some of these specialty olive oil stores are able to actually look at the polyphenol content of the actual olive oil. They know exactly where it came from, what the makeup is of it. So that could be an option. Um, there are some of your specialty grocers, like your Mediterranean stores or your Italian grocers, and they often have olive oil. And I mean, this stuff is pricey, but it is, you could almost think of it like I'd rather it replace one of your supplements, and it'll have like a label like wine does, that it comes from a certain vineyard at a certain time and has all that information on it. I can't guarantee it, but I think that's our best bet right now, because a lot of our olive oils have been adulterated, meaning they've added some of those omega-6 in to either reduce the cost, or it's just we don't have a lot of control over our olive oils in Canada.
Okay, so it might be best to like try something that's imported from elsewhere rather than go with one that's been made in Canada, I guess. I mean, that's what it sounds like, just like a little bit that might be, if there is not one specific product to recommend, that might be the safest bet. Am I hearing that correctly?
Yeah, generally not a lot of it's made in Canada because we don't grow a lot of
Yeah.
olives, but just knowing where that olive oil is coming from. And if
Okay.
somebody's um, interested, like really committed to their olive oil, they're going to put that stuff and take that extra effort.
Okay. Okay. Sounds good. Thank you. Okay, so the last question, and I think this is an important one because we hear about this a lot, where individuals in the community that are living with Crohn's or colitis, they're told or they may have this belief that it is hard for them to absorb nutrients, and they're wondering, is this the case all the time, or would it only be during a flare? Natasha or Deanna, if you have something to add.
It really depends on the individual because, for example, it depends on where the Crohn's disease is. Um, do you have a lot of stricturing, scarring? Um, what is the health of your gut? It's really hard to answer. And it's not even the best way, but the tool we have right now is to look at the blood. So seeing a dietitian along with your physician, um, a dietitian can assess the diet, but they can also make recommendations as to what you might want to look at as far as concerns with nutrient deficiencies.
Yeah, and I was just gonna
Okay.
say it is a really complicated question, um, because the intestine is, long, and so it's not necessarily the same in all of the places, like Natasha was mentioning. It also depends on the kind of microbes you have in at a given moment, depending on the diet that you took. So there's so many different factors. Um, yeah. So I don't think we need to believe that though. We don't need to believe that. It's, I think when you're in remission, like it's fair to say that you are probably absorbing nutrients at a reasonable rate.
Thank you. Okay, I think that's all the time. I'm keeping track, and I think that's it for questions. So thank you everybody for submitting questions ahead of time as well as during the live broadcast. If you didn't get your question answered or if something wasn't clear, if you need any other information about living with IBD or some support, please do email us at learn@crohnsandcolitis.ca and we will follow up with you directly. There were also a few cookbooks and research papers that were shared this evening. A few of you have asked in the chat to get a link to those or to get those recommendations as a reminder. So we will also share that in the email that you receive tomorrow, along with the link to the recording of the presentation. And so now, to wrap it up, we asked this at the start. How would you rate your current knowledge of the Mediterranean diet for Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis? Now we've heard this wonderful presentation from Natasha, Deanna. We've also heard Jennifer with her experiences with the Mediterranean diet. So we'd love to hear how you're feeling now. Okay, so we'll leave this open just for a few more moments. Okay, I think that's good. Let's share the results here. So, okay, so I remember there were like a lot more in the between like the threes, the fours, the fives. We've sort of trended upwards towards 10, and a lot that are saying at least 8 or higher. So that's really wonderful to see. Thanks very much, everyone, for sharing with us. And again, any other questions that you have, please do email us at learn@crohnsandcolitis.ca, and we will get back to you and share a copy of the presentation from today for a refresher. I think we just have a couple more slides here just to, um, you know, again, you can let us know your feedback by email, but what's even better is if you just take a few seconds at the end of the Zoom webinar, when you leave the Zoom or when we end the Zoom, you will be prompted with a short survey. There's a few questions. Shouldn't take you longer than a minute to complete. We look at the responses to all of these to make sure that we're, see what we're doing well, see what we can improve on. So please do fill out the survey to let us know what you think. And again, a reminder just that we do have some opportunities to connect with peers in the community. We've recently launched a digital community platform for our Gutsy Peer Support Program that Jennifer has been involved in for quite some time now. So I do encourage you to check this platform out. You can scan the QR code on the screen here, or you can visit Crohn's and Colitis Connect.ca, and you will be able to tour the platform there and start connecting with members of the community virtually. And finally, a special thanks to BG Communications for offering the live French interpretation for the webinar today. Thanks, everyone, again. Thank you again, Natasha, Deanna, Jennifer. Really appreciate you taking the time for us today. And if you don't already, you can follow us across our social media platforms at Get Gutsy Canada. Thanks, everyone, and hope you have a great evening.